January 31st, 1945. Clark Air Base, Luzon, Philippines. Major Frank McCoy stood in the tropical heat, staring at the aircraft before him. His camera shook slightly as he raised it to document what he was seeing. Behind him, members of his Technical Air Intelligence Unit waited, watching their commander's reaction. The bomber was pristine. Mitsubishi G4M, tail number 763-12, sitting on the tarmac like it had just rolled off the factory floor. No bullet holes, no fire damage, no twisted metal or shattered glass. The Japanese crew had simply abandoned it during the American advance, leaving behind a complete, operational example of their most important bomber. McCoy had spent 3 years examining crashed Japanese aircraft across the Pacific. Shattered Zeros pulled from jungle wreckage, destroyed bombers salvaged from shallow waters, burned-out hulks bulldozed off captured airfields. He thought he understood Japanese aviation by now. He climbed through the inspection panel into the wing. What he found there would change everything American forces thought they knew about their enemy. The fuel tanks were naked aluminum, 2 millimeters thick, nothing between thousands of liters of high-octane fuel and enemy machine gun fire. No rubber sealant, no armor plating, no fire suppression systems, no protective coating of any kind. McCoy stared at the thin metal skin in disbelief. He checked the other wing. Identical. He examined the fuselage tanks. Same story. 8 fuel tanks total, each one completely unprotected. "This cannot be standard," he said to the engineer beside him. "No Air Force would build bombers this way." But it was standard. They would discover that every Betty bomber rolling off Mitsubishi's production lines shared this same lethal characteristic. 2,400 aircraft built over 4 years of war, every single one deliberately designed without fuel tank protection. The Americans called it the Betty. The Japanese knew it as the Type 1 attack bomber. But crews on both sides had other names for it. Flying Zippo, one shot lighter, the flying coffin. And as Major McCoy's team began their systematic examination of tail number 763-12, the full story would emerge. Not a story of design failure or engineering incompetence, but something far more disturbing. A story of calculated sacrifice, of performance purchased with blood, of an aircraft that asked its crews to die for its extraordinary range. This is the story of the bomber that opened the Pacific War and ended it carrying a white flag. The aircraft that could strike targets 4,000 miles away but couldn't survive the final 100 miles to target. The flying machine that revealed the fundamental difference between how nations valued their warriors' lives. The mathematics of murder were written in those unprotected fuel tanks. McCoy just didn't know it yet. 4 years earlier, the Betty had introduced itself to America in fire and thunder. December 8, 1941. Dawn broke over Formosa with unusual clarity. On airfields across the island, Japanese ground crews swarmed over bombers, loading ordnance with practiced efficiency. 82 G4M Betty bombers and 26 older G3M Nell bombers. Their target, Clark Field, the primary American air base in the Philippines. The pilots gathered for final briefing, studying reconnaissance photographs of the American positions. They could see the B-17 flying fortresses lined up on the runways, rows of P-40 Warhawk fighters parked wingtip to wingtip, hangars full of spare aircraft and maintenance equipment. The Americans had no idea what was coming. At 10 a.m., the first wave lifted off. The Betty bombers climbed to 20,000 feet beyond the reach of American anti-aircraft guns. They formed up in precise V formations, each aircraft positioned exactly where tactical doctrine demanded. 460 miles to Clark Field, a distance no American bomber could match. Below them, the Pacific stretched to the horizon. Above them, nothing but empty sky. The Betty was built for this. Every rivet, every structural member, every design choice optimized for one purpose, reaching targets other bombers couldn't touch. At cruising speed, the formation covered ground at 240 miles per hour. The engine's 14-cylinder Mitsubishi Kasei radials hummed with mechanical precision. Each power plant generated 1,500 horsepower, driving three-bladed propellers that pulled the bombers through tropical air. Inside the aircraft, crews settled into their stations, 7 men per bomber. Pilot and co-pilot up front, surrounded by instruments and controls. Navigator hunched over his charts, calculating headings and fuel consumption. Bombardier preparing his sights for the attack run. Radio operator monitoring frequencies. 2 gunners, one in the dorsal position, one in the tail, scanning for fighters that never appeared. The formation reached Clark Field at 12:35 p.m.
American forces had received warnings of Japanese attacks elsewhere. Pearl Harbor had been struck hours earlier. War had officially begun. But confusion reigned across the Philippines. Some units were on alert. Others weren't. Most American aircraft remained on the ground, their crews uncertain whether orders would come to disperse or attack. The Betty bombers made the decision for them. 27 aircraft from the first wave rolled into their attack runs. The bombardiers carried through their sights, adjusting for windage and altitude. At 20,000 feet, the American base looked like a model spread across a table. Perfect targets, perfectly arranged. The first bombs fell at 12:36 p.m. 636 bombs in the initial wave. High explosive ordnance walking across runways, through hangars, into parked aircraft. The ground erupted in fountains of dirt and debris. Fuel trucks exploded. Ammunition dumps detonated in secondary blasts that rattled the Betty bombers even at altitude. Then the Zero fighters swept in at treetop level. The American fighters that survived the bombing run never got airborne. Zero pilots strafed the runways with methodical precision, their 7.7mm machine guns tearing through P-40s that sat helpless on the ground. Fuel tanks ruptured, wings collapsed, cockpits shattered. 17 B-17 Flying Fortresses had been parked at Clark Field that morning. By 1:30 p.m., 12 were destroyed. 53 P-40 fighters were reduced to burning wreckage. Hangars collapsed into rubble. Repair facilities were obliterated. Lieutenant James Harrington watched from a bomb shelter as his entire squadron died without firing a shot. In his combat report filed days later, he would write, "The precision was terrifying. They came in high, beyond our guns. Perfect formation. Then fighters dropped down and finished what the bombers started. We couldn't touch them." The Betty bombers turned north. Engines throttled back for the long flight home to Formosa. 460 miles, the same distance they had just covered. No American fighters pursued. No anti-aircraft fire followed them. They had struck from beyond retaliation range and departed the same way. American air power in the Philippines had been effectively eliminated in 45 minutes, but Clark Field was just the beginning. 2 days later, December 10th, the Betty proved it could kill more than airplanes. 500 miles to the west, British Admiral Tom Phillips commanded Force Z, a naval task force built around HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse. The battleship and battlecruiser represented the Royal Navy's power in Asian waters. Steel fortresses displacing 43,000 tons, armed with 14-inch guns that could hurl 1-ton shells 30 miles. Phillips believed his ships were invincible. Japanese aircraft couldn't threaten capital ships maneuvering in open water. The fleet air arm had proved as much during exercises. Bombers were too inaccurate, torpedoes were too slow. Warships with proper defensive fire could defeat any air attack. He was about to learn how wrong he was. 26 Betty bombers departed their bases in Indochina that morning, carrying Type 91 aerial torpedoes slung beneath their fuselages. 840 kilograms per weapon. 205-kilogram warheads designed specifically for shallow water operations, running at depths that could strike ships even in coastal waters. The formation found Force Z at 12:20 p.m. What followed stunned every naval observer who witnessed it. The Betty bombers didn't drop their torpedoes from high altitude. They descended to 200 feet above the waves and came in low, approaching the British ships from multiple directions simultaneously. Coordinated torpedo runs executed with precision that shouldn't have been possible for land-based bombers operating hundreds of miles from home base. Prince of Wales turned hard to starboard, trying to present minimal target profile. Her anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the sky with black bursts of explosive shells. But the Betty bombers kept coming. The first torpedo struck the battleship's port side, just forward of the bridge. The underwater explosion tore a hole 40 feet across. Water flooded through compartments designed to withstand shell fire, not massive internal detonations. Before damage control teams could respond, a second torpedo hit, then a third. Each explosion sent massive shockwaves through the ship's structure, buckling bulkheads and shattering machinery.
Repulse tried to maneuver clear, her captain ordering evasive action that had worked in previous engagements. But you can't dodge coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The Betty bombers had split their formation, approaching from different angles simultaneously. While Repulse turned away from torpedoes on her port side, weapons on her starboard side found their mark. 4 torpedoes struck the battle cruiser. Built during World War I and modernized in the 1930s, Repulse had been designed to withstand 16-inch shells. But underwater explosions are different. The physics of blast propagation through water means that energy travels differently than through air. Each torpedo impact sent massive shockwaves through the ship's hull, opening seams that shouldn't have opened, collapsing compartments that shouldn't have collapsed.
Both capital ships began listing. Prince of Wales capsized at 1:20 p.m. Repulse followed 13 minutes later. 841 British sailors died. The survivors, pulled from the water by escorting destroyers, could barely comprehend what had happened. 2 of the most powerful warships in the world sunk by bombers in less than 2 hours. For the first time in history, capital ships, actively defending themselves, had been destroyed solely by air power in open water. Battleship admirals, who had dismissed aircraft as nuisances, suddenly faced a new reality. The age of the battleship was ending. The Betty bomber had helped write its obituary. The aircraft that sank Force Z and destroyed Clark Field hadn't appeared by accident. Every capability, every strength, every fatal weakness was the product of deliberate choices made years before war began. September 1937, Mitsubishi Heavy Industries, Nagoya, Japan. Kishiro Honjo spread the Navy's requirements across his desk and did the mathematics that would define his career. The Imperial Japanese Navy wanted a land-based attack bomber with capabilities that seemed impossible. Top speed of 398 kilometers per hour, maximum range of 4,700 kilometers with bomb load, service ceiling of 10,000 meters. No bomber in service anywhere in the world could meet those specifications. The American B-17, then in development, had a range of 3,000 kilometers. The British Armstrong Whitworth Whitley, the RAF's newest bomber, could manage 2,500 kilometers. German designs fared no better. Japan's own G4M Nell bomber, currently in service, topped out at 3,000 kilometers. The Navy wanted a bomber that could fly nearly 50% farther than anything flying. Honjo understood why. Japan's empire stretched across vast Pacific distances. Naval bases were separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. The Navy needed aircraft capable of supporting operations across the entire theater. Bombers that could strike from bases beyond enemy fighter range. Aircraft that could project power across distances that would make them strategically decisive. But physics doesn't negotiate. Honjo assembled his team and began calculating weight budgets. Every kilogram mattered. The bomber would need massive fuel capacity. Each liter of aviation fuel weighed 0.8 kilograms. To fly 4,700 kilometers would require approximately 4,800 liters. That meant 3,800 kilograms of fuel at full load. To carry that fuel weight and still achieve the required speed meant minimizing every other weight source. The airframe itself would need to be as light as structural integrity permitted. The engines would need to be powerful yet efficient. And everything else, every system, every component, every protective measure would be scrutinized for possible weight reduction. Honjo studied bomber designs from multiple nations. American aircraft featured armor plating protecting crew positions.
self-sealing fuel tanks added substantial weight through rubber compounds that swelled to seal bullet holes. Fire suppression systems, redundant safety measures. The cumulative weight of adequate protection would exceed 500 kilograms. 500 kilograms that would come directly out of fuel capacity or range. The mathematics were brutal and simple. To achieve the range the Navy demanded, protection had to be sacrificed. Hanjo made his decision. The fuel tanks would be unprotected aluminum construction. No self-sealing compounds, no armor plating, no fire suppression beyond basic extinguishers. Every kilogram saved would be invested in fuel, in range, in meeting the Navy's specifications. His team argued, engineers who understood what combat damage would do to unprotected fuel tanks. Men who calculated the vulnerability being deliberately built into every aircraft. They knew that hits to the wings would be catastrophic. They understood that fire would be nearly certain from any fuel tank damage. Hanjo knew it too, but he also knew that the Navy's requirements couldn't be met any other way with available technology. The choice was between a bomber that met performance specifications with known vulnerabilities, or a bomber that failed to meet requirements but offered better protection. The Navy had demanded performance. Hanjo would deliver performance. Years later, after the war, after the losses, after the fires, surviving engineers would be asked why they made that choice. The answer was always the same. We believed the mission required it. We believed the pilots would have protection through tactical surprise and limited opposition. We believed the war would be short. They were wrong on every count. The first G4M prototype flew on October 23, 1939. It met every performance requirement. Speed exceeded expectations. Range surpassed projections. Payload capacity satisfied operational needs. The bomber entered production immediately.
By April 1941, the first operational units were receiving aircraft. By December 1941, approximately 180 Betty bombers served with the Japanese Navy. They would form the backbone of land-based strike capability throughout the coming war. And in their wings, in tanks holding thousands of liters of fuel, death waited for the men who would fly them. For 8 months, the Betty's design seemed vindicated. December 1941 through July 1942 saw Japanese forces sweeping across the Pacific. The Betty bombers struck targets from Darwin, Australia, to Port Moresby, New Guinea, to every major Allied position across the theater. Their range gave Japanese planners strategic flexibility that Allied commanders couldn't match. But everything changed at Guadalcanal. August 8, 1942, 23 Betty bombers departed Rabaul, bound for American positions 600 miles south. The flight would take them across the Solomon Sea, through the channel between island chains that sailors were already calling the Slot. Their target? Marine positions on Guadalcanal, where American forces had captured a crucial airfield the Japanese had been building. The crews who climbed aboard those bombers that morning were veterans. They had struck targets across the Pacific. They had sunk ships, destroyed bases, demolished enemy forces from Clark Field to Singapore. They knew their aircraft. They trusted their tactics. 23 bombers departed Rabaul. 5 would return. American F-4F Wildcat fighters intercepted the formation over Savo Island. The engagement lasted 30 minutes. When it ended, 18 Betty bombers had been shot down. Approximately 120 aviators were dead. The survivors who made it back to Rabaul told the same story. The fighters had torn through the formation like wolves through sheep. 2 or 3 hits anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and bombers exploded into flames. Men had no chance to bail out. The aircraft went from operational to burning wreckage in seconds. The attack had been the single worst loss the Betty Force would suffer in a single mission, but it wouldn't be the last devastating defeat. August 9th brought more losses. August 10th added to the tally. By the end of August, the 4th Air Group had been effectively destroyed as an operational unit.
The mathematical equation that Hanjo had calculated years earlier was being written in blood and fire across Guadalcanal skies. Inside the bombers, crews faced circumstances their designers never anticipated. Modern combat wasn't about surprise strikes against unprepared opponents. It was about sustained operations against prepared defenses with fighter coverage. And every design choice that had maximized Babetti's range became a death sentence. Flight Petty Officer Masayuki Nakao described his combat experience in his diary, recovered after the war. "The Americans wait for us. Their radar sees us long before we see them. Their fighters climb to altitude and position themselves. We fly in formation, knowing what is coming, unable to prevent it. When they attack, we fire back with everything we have. But if they hit the wings, we burn. Always we burn." The unprotected fuel tanks that gave the Betty its extraordinary range meant that any combat damage was potentially catastrophic. American pilots learned this quickly. Where they might need sustained fire to bring down other aircraft, the Betty required only brief bursts. Hit the wings where the fuel tanks were concentrated. Watch the flames bloom, move to the next target. Lieutenant Commander John Blackburn, commanding VF-17 flying F-4U Corsairs, described hunting Betty formations. "First time we engaged them, we couldn't believe how easily they went down. Hit them anywhere along the fuselage or wings, and they'd light up like matches. After that, we actively sought them out. They were among the easiest kills in Pacific skies." The nickname spread through American squadrons. Flying Zippo, after the famous lighter. One-shot bomber. Flying cigar for the way they burned from end to end. Japanese crews heard these names through intelligence reports. They knew what enemy pilots called their aircraft. They flew anyway because orders were orders and duty demanded it. September 1942 brought no relief. Betty formations continued striking American positions, and American fighters continued destroying them in overwhelming numbers. October saw the pattern intensify. By November, when the Guadalcanal campaign effectively ended, Betty losses exceeded 100 aircraft. Crew casualties approached 700 men dead. The exchange rate was mathematically unsustainable. Japan's most capable land-based bomber had been rendered obsolete by its own vulnerabilities. Statistics tell one story. The men who flew the Betty bombers told another. Inside the aircraft, life followed rhythms that mixed routine and terror. Pre-flight inspections that everyone performed knowing the fragility of what they were inspecting. Briefings where target information mattered less than fighter opposition estimates. The climb to altitude, engines straining, fuel gauges showing the slow decrease that would continue until they returned to base, or didn't return at all.
The Betty's interior was cramped despite the aircraft's size. 7 men sheared a tube 20 meters long and just over 2 meters wide. The pilot and co-pilot sat side by side in the nose, surrounded by instruments that glowed faintly in the darkness of night missions. Behind them, the navigator crouched over his charts, calculating courses by dead reckoning when darkness hid the stars. The bombardier lay prone in the nose position during attack runs, his face pressed to the bomb site, everything reduced to the intersection of crosshairs on a target below. The radio operator worked his equipment in the fuselage, monitoring frequencies for warnings that might give precious seconds of survival time. The dorsal gunner stood in his position, hands on the Type 92 7.7mm machine gun, scanning the sky for fighters that could appear from any direction. The tail gunner sat isolated at the aircraft's rear, alone with his weapon and his thoughts. During missions, conversation was limited. The roar of engines made communication difficult. Radio discipline demanded silence except for critical information. So crews flew in a cocoon of engine noise and their own thoughts, knowing that at any moment, without warning, their aircraft might bloom into flames around them. Flight Petty Officer Hiroshi Kawamoto, who survived 38 Betty missions before transfer to training duties, described the constant tension. You never relax. From takeoff to landing, you're waiting for the moment, waiting for the fighter attack you might not see coming, waiting for the shell that finds the fuel tanks, waiting for the fire. Every mission, you watch other aircraft in the formation. You see them explode. One moment, they're flying on your wing. The next moment, there's burning wreckage falling toward the ocean. You fly through the debris field. Oil spray hits your windscreen. You continue the mission. The fires were the worst part. Everyone who flew the Betty feared fire more than any other form of death. Battle damage that would disable other bombers meant escape, bailout, possible survival, but Betty bombers didn't get disabled. They exploded.
The physics were simple and terrible. Unprotected fuel tanks meant that tracer rounds, incendiary bullets, or explosive shells that penetrated the wing would ignite fuel vapor. Aluminum provided no barrier. Then sheet metal designed only for aerodynamic purposes couldn't withstand bullets, couldn't contain fire, couldn't give crews time to escape. Surviving crews reported seeing friends burn, men trapped in gun positions as flames consumed the fuselage, pilots staying at controls trying to keep the aircraft level so others could bail out, dying at their stations when the fire reached them. Crew members jumping from burning aircraft at low altitude, choosing instant death from impact over burning alive. The Japanese Navy trained its air crews to exceptional standards. Men who flew the Betty were among the most skilled aviators in the world. They could navigate across thousands of miles of open ocean. They could find targets in darkness. They could execute coordinated attacks with precision that Allied observers considered impossible. But no amount of skill could compensate for the fundamental vulnerability built into every aircraft they flew. April 18, 1943, the Betty's most famous casualty. Admiral Yamamoto, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and commander of the combined fleet, was flying from Rabaul to Bougainville for an inspection tour. He traveled aboard a Betty bomber with fighter escort, following a schedule that had been transmitted by radio in a code the Japanese believed was secure. American codebreakers had broken that code months earlier. They read Yamamoto's itinerary with perfect clarity, knowing exactly where he would be and when he would be there. 18 P-38 Lightning fighters departed Guadalcanal at 7:25 a.m., flying at wave-top height to avoid radar detection. They covered 400 miles of open ocean using nothing but dead-reckoning navigation and timing. One aircraft turned back with mechanical problems. Another suffered drop tank failure. 16 continued the mission. At 9:34 a.m., exactly on schedule, exactly at the calculated intercept point, the P-38s spotted Yamamoto's formation. 2 Betty bombers flying at low altitude with 6-0 fires as escort. Captain Thomas Lanphier and First Lieutenant Rex Barber broke from the formation to engage the bombers while other P-38s held off the Zeros. Barber rolled in behind the lead Betty, the aircraft carrying Japan's most important military commander. The Betty tried to evade, diving toward the jungle canopy. But the P-38 was faster and more maneuverable. Barber's guns found the bomber's wings, right where the unprotected fuel tanks were positioned. The Betty exploded into flames. It crashed in the jungle. Yamamoto's body was recovered the following day. He had been killed by injuries sustained during the crash, though whether from impact or from fire would never be determined with certainty. The operation demonstrated multiple aspects of Allied superiority: American signals intelligence, precision navigation, fighter capability. But it also demonstrated the Betty's fundamental vulnerability. Once intercepted, once engaged, the bomber had no chance of survival. The aircraft carrying Japan's most important military leader had been protected by fighter escort, flown by experienced crews, operated with full knowledge of enemy threat. None of it mattered. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that successful interception would be fatal. By mid-1943, Japanese engineers recognized that modifications were essential. The question was whether meaningful changes were even possible. The first attempt came in March 1943, starting with the 663rd aircraft produced. 30mm rubber sheets were installed beneath wing surfaces where fuel tanks were located. The modification was a compromise, adding minimal weight while providing limited protection against fuel leakage. It didn't work. The rubber sheets could slow fuel leakage from small caliber hits. They couldn't prevent fires from larger rounds. They couldn't stop explosions when tracers ignited fuel vapor. The fundamental vulnerability remained unchanged. Crew survival rates showed no significant improvement. The modification reduced top speed by 9 kilometers per hour. Maximum range decreased by 315 kilometers. Betty bombers were becoming slightly slower and shorter ranged without becoming any more survivable. By October 1944, designers attempted more comprehensive protection with the G4M Model 3. This variant featured actual self-sealing fuel tanks with capacity reduced to accommodate leak-blocking material.
The modification reduced maximum range to 3,600 kilometers, a loss of more than 2,000 kilometers compared to the original model. 60 G4M Model 3 aircraft were produced by war's end. 60 aircraft, out of more than 2,000 Betty bombers built. The modification came too late and in too limited numbers to affect anything. By late 1944, American air superiority was so complete that no level of fuel tank protection would have permitted Betty bombers to operate effectively. The crews who received the modified aircraft understood what the changes represented, an admission that the original design had been fatally flawed, and acknowledgement that thousands of men had died in aircraft that should never have been sent into combat without protection, a recognition that came years too late to save the crews already lost. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's most successful fighter pilots, wrote about the Betty in his memoirs. "Our bomber crews were the bravest men I ever knew. They climbed into aircraft that would explode from the slightest damage and flew into combat anyway. They knew the danger. Everyone knew the danger. But duty demanded they fly, so they flew. And they died. By the hundreds, by the thousands. The Betty bomber killed more of our own men than any enemy weapon." The Betty's vulnerability reached its most devastating demonstration in the war's final months. 18 Betty bombers departed Kanoya Air Base carrying MY-X-7 Oka rocket bombs beneath their fuselages. The Oka was a piloted, rocket-powered aircraft with a 1,200-kilogram warhead designed for kamikaze attacks against American ships. 1,200 kilograms of explosives attached to a rocket that could accelerate to 650 kilometers per hour in its terminal dive. The weapon theoretically was devastating. In practice, it required the Betty bombers to fly within 20 kilometers of their targets before release. 20 kilometers while carrying external weapons that added weight, created drag, and prevented evasive maneuvers. The mission required Betty bombers to survive in the heavily defended airspace on Earth. American naval forces off Okinawa had hundreds of fighters on combat air patrol. Radar coverage extended more than 100 miles. Every ship had modern anti-aircraft systems. The defensive network was designed specifically to prevent exactly this type of attack. The Betty formation departed at 2:30 p.m. 18 bombers in tight formation, each carrying an Oka weapon, with fighter escort heading toward American naval forces. American radar detected them at 100 miles distance. F-6F Hellcat fighters scrambled from USS Hornet. They reached the Japanese formation well before it approached weapon release range. What followed was systematic destruction. The Betty bombers, already vulnerable under normal circumstances, were completely helpless while carrying Oka weapons. The additional weight prevented evasive maneuvers. The external weapon created drag that reduced speed. The unprotected fuel tanks guaranteed that any hit would be fatal. American fighters worked through the formation methodically. One by one, the bombers exploded and fell into the ocean. Some tried to jettison their Oka weapons to gain speed and maneuverability. It didn't matter. The fighters kept coming. Not a single Betty bomber survived to reach release range. Not a single Oka weapon was launched against American ships. 137 bomber crew members died. 15 Oka pilots died. The mission accomplished nothing except adding to loss statistics that had long since become meaningless. The Oka mission represented the ultimate expression of the Betty's fundamental flaw. An aircraft designed to deliver weapons to distant targets couldn't survive to deliver those weapons when facing prepared opposition. The extraordinary range that made the mission theoretically possible meant nothing when aircraft exploded before reaching weapon release range. August 19, 1945. 4 days after Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender, 2 white-painted Betty bombers departed Atsugi Airfield. Green crosses marked their fuselages where national insignia had been removed. The paint was hastily applied, barely dry, making the aircraft appear ghostly in morning light. They carried Japanese representatives to discuss surrender terms with Allied forces. The aircraft had been given call signs that carried deliberate symbolism.
Bataan 1 and Bataan 2. Bataan, where American forces had surrendered to Japan in April 1942. Now, 3 years later, aircraft bearing those call signs carried Japan's surrender delegation. Lieutenant Tomu Hideo piloted one of the surrender aircraft. He wore his dress uniform rather than flight suit. The aircraft carried no weapons, no ammunition, no military equipment except what was necessary for flight. American fighters escorted the White Betty bombers throughout their journey, protective and supervisory simultaneously. The symbolism was profound and unavoidable. The bomber that had opened the Pacific War at Clark Field in December 1941 now carried Japan's surrender delegation in August 1945. The aircraft that had symbolized Japanese air power's reach and effectiveness now symbolized defeat and submission. Inside the White Betty bombers, Japanese officials stared through windows at American fighter escorts flying formation around them. The same fighters that had destroyed so many Betty bombers throughout the war now guided these last examples to their final mission. Protection replaced predation. The hunters had become shepherds. The White Betty bombers landed safely, their passengers transferring to American C-54 transports for the flight to Manila. The surrender process began with Japanese representatives boarding American aircraft, leaving their own bombers behind. Those white aircraft with green crosses would be among the last Betty bombers to fly operational missions. The circle was complete. First strike to final surrender. Opening the war to ending it. From weapons of conquest to symbols of defeat. The final production statistics tell their own story. Approximately 2,414 Betty bombers were produced across all variants between 1940 and 1945. Nearly 1,200 G4M Model 1 aircraft with completely unprotected fuel tanks. 1,142 Model 2 aircraft with minimal modifications. 60 Model 3 aircraft with actual self-sealing tanks that came too late to matter. Many Betty bombers survived to war's end. The overwhelming majority were destroyed in combat, consumed by the fires that unprotected fuel tanks made inevitable. Loss rates exceeded anything Japanese planners had projected. Crew casualties reached levels that would have been considered unacceptable by any Western Air Force. Thousands of Japanese airmen died in Betty bombers. The exact number may never be known. Records were destroyed, units were scattered. But what is certain is that the Betty's crew casualty rate exceeded every other Japanese bomber type by significant margins. Back at Clark Field, Major McCoy's team completed their examination of tail number 763-12. Their classified report detailed every specification, every system, every design choice. The document was distributed to all Allied air forces as critical intelligence about enemy capabilities and doctrine. But the report's most important section wasn't technical specifications or performance data. It was the analysis of design philosophy. American engineers struggled to comprehend the calculated trade-offs Japanese designers had made. The deliberate sacrifice of protection for performance. The acceptance of catastrophic crew casualties in exchange for extended range. The report's conclusions were stark. Japanese designers created an aircraft optimized ruthlessly for performance with no consideration for crew survival. The unprotected fuel system makes combat loss nearly certain when damaged. This design philosophy reflects a fundamental difference in how Japanese military doctrine values human life versus mission accomplishment. American bombers told a different story. The B-17 Flying Fortress featured armor plating protecting pilot and co-pilot seats, armored bulkheads throughout the fuselage, and self-sealing fuel tanks from the B-17C model onward. The weight penalty exceeded 1,000 pounds. American doctrine considered this essential and non-negotiable.
American studies demonstrated the effectiveness quantitatively. Body armor reduced thoracic wound fatalities from 36% to 8%. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced fire-related casualties by similar margins. Protected crew positions increased survival rates 3 to 4 times when aircraft were damaged in combat. The weight cost for this protection was substantial, But American industrial capacity permitted the weight penalty without sacrificing production numbers. Factories produced over 12,000 B-17 bombers and nearly 10,000 B-24 Liberators during the war. Production capacity meant American forces could field large numbers of protected bombers without compromising capability. Japanese doctrine reached different conclusions. The Betty's design reflected calculations that range and striking power outweighed crew survival. The assumptions underlying these calculations proved catastrophically wrong within months of war's start. In 2018, researchers located the wreckage of multiple Betty bombers in waters around the Solomon Islands. Remote cameras revealed aircraft lying in coral-encrusted graves, their aluminum skin corroded by decades of salt water, their fuel tanks still visible through deteriorated wing structures. The wrecks serve as underwater monuments to the men who died in them. Each aircraft represents 7 crew members. Multiply by the number of Betty bombers lost and the scale of sacrifice becomes clear. Thousands of highly trained aviators killed in aircraft whose design made their deaths nearly inevitable once combat began. The Betty bomber's story raises questions that extend beyond technical specifications into fundamental military ethics. What is acceptable risk? How should designers balance capability against survivability? What is the value of human life in warfare? American designers answered those questions by prioritizing protection even at the cost of performance. Every pound of armor, every protective system, every safety measure represented a conscious choice that trained crews were more valuable than marginal performance improvements. Japanese designers answered differently. They believed range and striking power justified accepting catastrophic casualties. They calculated that strategic advantage gained from extended operational radius outweighed crew survival considerations. They were wrong, but thousands of men paid the price for that miscalculation. The mathematics of the Betty's war were written in fire. Every advantage that made the aircraft formidable in early 1942 became irrelevant once sustained combat began. Range meant nothing when bombers exploded before reaching targets. Speed meant nothing when fighters could intercept from distant bases with radar warning. Payload capacity meant nothing when formations were destroyed before weapon release. The crew of tail number 763-12 had survived by walking away from their aircraft during the American advance on Clark Field. They were among the fortunate ones. Most Betty crews had no opportunity to walk away. They flew missions knowing the danger, climbed into unprotected bombers, crossed vast Pacific distances, and died in overwhelming numbers. Major McCoy's photographs of the intact Betty at Clark Field became classified documents that would influence aircraft design for decades. The images showed an aircraft that met every performance specification its designers had targeted: speed, range, payload, all achieved exactly as intended. But the photographs also showed the cost. Fuel tanks separated from enemy fire by 2 millimeters of aluminum. Wing structures designed without regard for survivability. An aircraft optimized for mission accomplishment without consideration for bringing crews home. In the end, the Betty bomber stands as evidence of what happens when capability is prioritized over survivability, when range is purchased with crew lives, when performance requirements override protection considerations. The thousands of burning Betty bombers across Pacific skies marked the consequences of that philosophical difference. The nation that valued crew survival built an air force that could sustain operations indefinitely. The nation that accepted catastrophic casualties for performance advantages built an air force that destroyed itself through attrition. The examination of tail number 763-12 provided final proof of what Allied forces had suspected for years. The Betty bomber wasn't poorly designed. It was brilliantly designed to achieve specific goals. Those goals simply didn't include bringing Japanese crews home alive. And in that single fact lies the entire story of the aircraft that opened the Pacific War and ended it painted white with green crosses. The bomber that could strike 4,000 miles but couldn't survive the final 100. The flying machine that revealed more about military doctrine than any tactical manual ever could. The Betty's legacy lives on in coral-covered wrecks scattered across the Pacific floor. Each aircraft a monument, each monument marking 7 graves, each grave representing a young man who climbed into an unprotected bomber because duty demanded it, knowing that the very aircraft meant to carry him to battle was designed in a way that made his death nearly certain.
They called it the Flying Zippo, the one-shot lighter, the machine gun cruiser's flying cousin. But the men who flew it called it something else in their final moments, as flames consumed unprotected fuel tanks and turned bombers into funeral pyres. They called it exactly what it was: a death trap with wings.